Alright everyone, welcome back to the Neverglades. Today, we join Hannigan facing the saddening inevitability of death at his father-in-law's funeral. But, shortly after, he meets up with an old friend and begins chasing a strange wave of suicides that sweep the town. I hope you all enjoy the first entry of the 7th part of the Neverglades mysteries, Lucid Dreams. In a small town like Pacific Glade, death isn't always faceless. It hits you especially hard when you're a cop. That body dragged into the coroner's office, that victim slumped and broken behind the lines of police tape. That could be your neighbor, or your kid's algebra teacher, or that sweet old lady you pass every week at the grocery store. Death doesn't just come for people on TV. Death slips by you every day, so close you can feel the breeze on your cheeks as it passes, and it leaves your world a little emptier. Sometimes you notice, sometimes you don't. But it changes you either way. My father-in-law, Peter Lambrecht, died on an early spring morning. He was gray-haired and stooped, but spry for his age, and the carved wooden cane he walked with was mostly for show. He'd brag to anyone who'd listen about how he'd won the stick off a stranger at the Hanging Rock. "Had him sulking in the corner like a raccoon in an empty trash can," he'd say. "Never seen the cards hate a man the way they did that day. He was strung up and he knew it. Threw his hand on the table and stormed out. Not before leaving me this beauty." Then he'd show it off by dancing a little jig. He called it his wizard's staff. It was his prized possession, his lucky talisman. But even luck can't stop death when it's barreling towards you at 80 miles an hour. He'd just stepped outside to grab the paper, leaning sturdily against his lucky staff, plodding through the dewy grass to the mailbox. The morning air was cold and his joints must have been aching, but he pressed stubbornly onwards, all the way to the street. The newspaper boy had shoved the thing deep and he had to set the cane aside to yank it out. I don't know if he heard the engine getting closer. When he set his mind to something, my dear old father-in-law tended to get lost in his own thoughts. And it wasn't uncommon to see him glaze-eyed and staring off into space. The driver of the car was named Vera Hanscom. She was going fast, way faster than the crappy old minivan was probably built to handle, but there was a wailing baby in the back seat with a spreading rash and 2 small children who were yelling over each other about God knows what. Poor harried Vera turned back for just a second to put the kids in their place, but her hand slipped as she did so, and the minivan lurched onto the sidewalk like a drunken man. It was only for a second, but 1 second was all it took. The van struck Peter head-on and sent him flying across the yard. The coroner told me he was dead before he struck the side of the neighbor's house. "Broken back," he'd said, among other things. I didn't need to know the details. All I knew was that there would be no more jigs, no more stories. Just glazed eyes forever. Vera knew what she had done, but she panicked and hightailed it away from the scene with her 3 screaming children in tow. She might have gotten away, too, if another neighbor hadn't seen the whole thing and phoned in her license to the police. In no time, she was surrounded by cruisers, sirens blaring and lights flashing. The terrified mother left the vehicle with her hands up and tears streaming down her cheeks. They took her and the children down to the station, where Vera wept and shook and confessed to the whole thing, her whole body heaving with sobs. Calls were made, officers sent to bring in the body. Everyone was running around trying to keep the situation from getting any worse. It was a big fucking mess. In all the confusion, everyone forgot about the rashy little infant, whose wailing had given way to a soft, pained whimper. In a matter of hours, the baby was dead. Vera didn't even notice until she tried rocking the tiny corpse awake. If she hadn't broken before, that was the crack that split her open. People say her anguished cries could be heard for miles. Karma, some might say. A life for a life. Which is bullshit, of course, because no cosmic force was watching over that road. None that cared, anyway. Death came and death went, and left 2 big holes where it had been. And that was it. The story went on. This time it was missing a couple of players. Nico Sanchez was the one who called us at home, and Ruth was the one who answered. I didn't know what they were discussing at first, but I saw Ruth's smile slip, saw her warm persona falter for just a moment, and I knew enough. She composed herself quickly and listened to what Sanchez had to say, but that half-second slip had said it all. And even though I never saw her cry, not even at the funeral, I knew it was taking everything she had to keep herself composed. She did it, though. She smiled at the mourners and told them stories and hugged them close and eased their pain, even when she herself was hurting, because that was Ruth. I was the cop, but she'd always been the fighter. The wake was a quiet affair. Peter had been one of those rare souls who'd actually moved to the Glade and stayed here. Something about the place seemed to discourage visitors from staying long, but not Peter. He loved the trees, loved the cool summers and the way the sun set so strangely. So he planted himself down, and before long it was like he'd lived here all his life. The consequence of this was that most of his family lived outside Pacific Glade, and apparently had no desire to come here, not even to see him off. Ruth's cousin, Trina, was the only member of the Lambrecht clan to show up on the day of the wake. The rest of the mourners, few as they were neighbors and friends, fellow Gladers here to honor one of their own. The Locklear funeral home wasn't extravagant, but Ruth had worked with the family to drape the visitation room in violet banners, Peter's favorite color, and lay out a table of small refreshments. I grabbed a glass of water and eyed the vegetable platter, wondering if it would be distasteful to munch away during my father-in-law's wake. Ruth wandered by me, and I took the opportunity to leave the food and join her by Peter's casket. The dead are just sleeping, I thought, and not for the first time. Ruth's dad looked like he'd simply nodded off for a bit. The coroner had set his limbs straight and given his cheeks a blush he'd never had in life. I've seen plenty of corpses, and after the whole embalming thing, most of them look like waxy mannequins. Peter looked like he might wake up at any moment. A familiar stick lay with him in the casket. The cane had survived what its owner had not. Whole and unbroken, it now rested under Peter's cold hands. His talisman would go to the grave with him. "Did I ever tell you he took me flying?" I said. "Back when we were engaged. He rented a helicopter somehow and he flew us all over the glade. I had no idea he knew how to pilot one of those things. He would do all these dips and dives, it scared the shit out of me. Every time he would laugh that wheezy, good-natured laugh of his, and I knew we weren't in any real danger." I took a sip from my glass. At one point, he even let me take over. And looking down at everything, God, Ruth, it was incredible. It was like being one of the birds. You never really appreciate the trees until you see them from up there. And the lakes and the rivers and the highways cutting through the forest, they looked like one big nervous system, like this huge engine keeping the glade in motion. Puts things in perspective, you know? Ruth didn't look at me. She swished the water in her own glass and stared down at her father's body. "I never knew he flew," she said. "It doesn't surprise me. Dad always did seem to be reaching for the sky." I kissed her hair and held her close for a moment. She leaned her head against mine and sighed. That was the moment I expected the tears to flow, for all the sadness to come gushing out, but after a few seconds she gently detached herself and went to talk with her cousin. I listened to her hushed voice, but couldn't make out a word of the conversation. The wake went on for another couple hours as mourners straggled in and out. I finally gave in and went for the hors d'oeuvres. They'd barely been touched, which seemed like a waste to me, and was in the process of biting into a canapé when my son Rory approached, holding a cup of water. He was small for his age, and the suit we rented for him looked absurdly big on his tiny shoulders. He picked at his cuffs and stared up at me. It looked like he wanted to say something. "What is it, Rory?" He bit his lip, eyes wide, and I thought a little bit scared. For a second I thought he wasn't going to speak at all. And then, under his breath, he mumbled, "I saw Grandpa." "I know," I said. "It's not easy to see him lying there like that," but Rory shook his head vigorously. I don't mean in the coffin," he said. "I meant outside." A tiny chill went through me, but I suppressed it. I smiled down at my son and patted his shoulder in what I hoped was a reassuring way. "I'm sure it's nothing," I said, "but why don't you show me anyway?" Rory bit his lip again, but nodded. He led me over to the window by the refreshment table. Placing down his cup, he raised a finger and pointed through the glass. "Grandpa was out there," he muttered, "in the graveyard. He just stood there and stared at me." I leaned closer and peered out the window. Locklear Cemetery was solemn in the dusk light, a sea of jutting tombstones and monuments. The place was deserted. I started to feel a twinge of relief. Rory's overactive imagination was probably getting the better of him again. But then I saw a slight figure standing in the shadow of a tall obelisk. It was too dark to make out much about him, but he appeared to be wearing a pressed black suit, and in his hands he clutched a very distinctive wooden cane. I shot a startled look at Peter's casket. The wizard's staff lay there, as always, held beneath those pale, dead hands. When I looked back, the figure in the shadow was gone. "Did you see him?" Rory asked nervously. No, I said. "There's someone out there, but it's obviously not Grandpa. Probably just some guy paying his respects to a dead relative." I reached out and ruffled Rory's hair, even though it felt forced to me, and probably Rory too. He looked unconvinced. A slight frown tugged at his mouth, his eyes still locked on the window. I looked back outside with him. There was no dark figure anymore, and even if there had been, that didn't mean Rory and I had seen a ghost. A lot of old people walked on canes, so what if the guy out there had one that looked an awful lot like Peter's? But this was the Neverglades we were talking about. Weird shit central. And I had a bad feeling that whatever we'd seen out there was just the beginning. 2 weeks passed without incident, and over time I gradually forgot about the specter Rory and I had seen. I had my hands full with other cases, nothing weird for once, just human crimes with human criminals. A man had been killed in his home with a pair of garden shears, and I was pretty sure I knew who'd done it, but I didn't have the evidence to make an arrest yet. 9 o'clock Thursday night found me at the Beaver Street Diner, rummaging through stacks of paperwork and trying to spot a thread in this whole tangled mess. I was so wrapped up in my work at first that I didn't notice the faint smell of tobacco entering the diner. It was only when a long shadow fell across the table that I looked up and noticed my visitor standing there. His cigar smoke was a normal shade of gray, and his skin didn't look quite so pallid, but he was still the weirdest looking patron in the diner by a long mile. "Inspector," I said. It's been a while." He gestured to the empty booth opposite me with a tilt of his head. "May I sit?" "I suppose." I gathered the papers I'd strewn across the table and stuffed them back into their manila folder. The inspector took a seat with that unsettling grace of his. He wove his hands together and leaned forward, the tip of his cigar glowing. "I know we haven't spoken in quite some time," he said quietly. "And I know you probably have no interest in pleasantries, so I'll cut to the chase. I found a new case, and I'd like your help solving it." A waitress wandered over and asked the inspector if he'd like some coffee, but he waved a vague hand in her direction and she turned back to the counter, looking mildly dazed. I watched her go with an unpleasant clenching in my stomach. "Can you not do that shit?" I muttered. "I still have nightmares about that little freak show you put on behind the rift. I don't need you showing off your fucking god powers." The inspector looked hurt, and for a second I felt guilty, but only for a second. It was hard to feel empathy for a being who was literally bigger than a planet. He sat silently in the other booth, still puffing out that toxic smoke, still staring with those eerie purple eyes. Eventually, he broke the stare and looked out the window into the parking lot. "I understand where you're coming from, Mark," he said, "but I just want to help." "So help then." I drummed my fingers on the folder of case files. "What's this case of yours, and why haven't I heard of it?" "It's not a homicide," he said, turning back to me. "So it wouldn't have found its way to your desk." He reached into his sleeve and withdrew a series of photographs, which he scattered on the table. "In the past several weeks, there have been 8 separate suicides in town. None of them showed any sign of depression before the fact. When I questioned their families, I learned that several of the victims had become obsessed with dead relatives before they killed themselves, poring through photo albums, visiting gravestones, digging up old heirlooms from the attic. 3 days of this obsession, and then death." He began arranging the photos with his slender fingers. All 8 of them drowned themselves in their bathtubs. I eyed the photos with some hesitation. To my dismay, I recognized a few of the faces. Chester Maines, Nicole Kramer, Veronica Stapleton, Mike Schneider. They were all familiar fixtures around town. Chester managed the supermarket on Brook Street, Nicole was our senior librarian, Veronica led the local Girl Scout troop, and Mike ran the auto shop down in the center of town. I'd seen him the other month to get my new cruiser checked. He'd been a real pleasant guy, always smiling with a bright laugh and a mouthful of pearly whites. The idea of him killing himself seemed next to impossible. "Okay," I said, taking a deep breath. "Okay, that definitely is on the weird side, but what do you need me for?" "You know this town, Mark," the inspector said. "You know these people better than I ever could. Is there anything that links them together? Any commonality that could help us understand why they might do this?" I examined the line of photographs. All the faces, even the ones I didn't know, looked like neighbors to me. The pictures were exactly what the news would show when their deaths were reported to the public. Smiling mouths turned to the camera, rosy cheeks, laughter in their eyes. The news didn't want death to be faceless. It's like the newscasters wanted to say, look at this happiness, because that's all you get. That happiness is dead. Now it's just emptiness, empty rooms, empty hearts, empty homes. "Hang on," I said. "I have an idea." I flipped through my case files and pulled out a map of the Neverglades, which I'd been using to mull over the garden shearers killers' potential hideouts. I grabbed my pen and marked an X over the supermarket on Brook Street, and then I drew another X over the public library. The inspector watched me work, pensive smoke billowing from his mouth. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Each X marks a place where the victims lived or worked," I said, placing another above Veronica Stapleton's house. "If this thing is widespread, then maybe there's a sphere of influence, an epicenter. Maybe it could be like the entity in the radio, broadcasting, I don't know, some kind of suicide wave." Another X over Mike's auto shop. 4 marks hardly made a pattern, though, and I struggled to think of what I was missing. Then a thought came to mind. Rory pointing out the window and a strange figure with a dead man's cane lurking in the shadows of the gravestones. I reached out and scrawled a final X over Locklear Cemetery. "What happened there?" the inspector asked, frowning. "Dead relatives," I replied. "You said the victims all got obsessed with dead relatives." "Well, that's where my son saw my father-in-law up and walking, at his own wake." I looked up at the inspector. "I saw him too." The inspector leaned back in the booth and ran a thumb along the brim of his fedora. "Interesting," he mused. "Perhaps the victims all saw their dead relatives before they, He didn't finish, but I got the implication. "I'm not feeling particularly suicidal, so don't worry about me," I said. "Let's just see where our epicenter is." I took the pen and drew a rough, wobbly circle around the 5 X's. Inside the circle was a shapeless mass of trees, and inside them, clear and blue and perfectly round, was Lake Lucid. The epicenter is Lake Lucid. The inspector shot upright in his seat. "Of course," he said. "Of course. Mark, do you know the main water supply for those 5 locations?" "Well, I can't speak for most of them," I said, "but I know Locklear Funeral Home uses filtered water from the lake. It's barely a mile from the shore." The inspector rose from his seat and began pacing beside the table. A few amused patrons looked over at him, but either he didn't notice them or didn't care. "The water's been contaminated," he muttered. "When consumed, it induces hallucinations, obsession, depression. Enough exposure and the victims drowned themselves in it." He stopped and turned to face me. "I think I know exactly what contaminant we're dealing with." "Do you now?" I said. "You've known me long enough, Mark," he replied. "Of course I do. Now, come on. We have to get to the lake and stop this thing before its influence spreads across the entire glade." He spun around and strode out of the diner, his coat flapping behind him as he walked. I watched him go, and in spite of myself, I smiled. He looked so gung-ho when he caught the scent of a case. He kind of reminded me of me, actually, back when I'd first joined the force, all swagger and confidence and full of the stuff of justice. "He's a monster," my brain whispered. "He could crush you and your family without blinking an eye." But that little warning voice was getting easier to ignore. Monster or not, he was here to help. And deep down, or not so deep down, really, I think a part of me had missed the guy. Lake Lucid was dark and starless when the inspector and I arrived. I pulled my cruiser into the parking lot and stepped out into the cool night. The moon was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, and the surface of the lake had a strange, murky sheen I'd never seen before. We approached the shore and watched the wavelets lap at the sand. "So the suicide wave is coming from somewhere down there," I said. I looked skeptically at the grimy water. "I hate to break it to you, Inspector, but unless you've got scuba gear tucked away in some secret pocket dimension, we may be at a dead end here." The inspector stared thoughtfully at the moonless sky. Thin smoke drifted from the end of his cigar. And then he turned to me and scrutinized my face. I didn't like it. It made me think of a scientist squinting at a disappointing test subject. "Hold still," he said at last. "Wait, what are you—" The inspector removed his cigar and blew a cloud of blue smoke into my face. I coughed and sputtered. The smell was rancid, like rotten fish. Then a searing pain stabbed into my neck, and the breath whooshed out of me in a gasp. Trying to draw in air was suddenly like gulping in a vacuum. I lurched forward and plunged into the lake, my body flailing. I hit the water with a tremendous splash and sank beneath the surface. The lake was cold and murky, and through the cracks of my eyes I could only make out a tangle of weeds and a few darting fish. Water rushed into my mouth, but instead of choking me, it slurped into my lungs with a cool, sated sensation. I clapped a hand to my neck and felt a series of tiny slits that hadn't been there before. They flapped outward with each breath, releasing a stream of bubbles. There was another splash as the inspector dove in after me. He floated in the murk, the tails of his trench coat splayed out like a manta ray. He still hadn't let go of that damn cigar. The glowing orange tip somehow refused to go out. "Gills!" I shouted. My voice burbled outward in a stream of bubbles muted by the water. "You gave me fucking gills? This is exactly the kind of shit I'm talking about. You can't just play God and fuck around with my body like this." "I'll remove them when we're done," the inspector said, a touch defensive. "Besides, it was necessary. You couldn't possibly hold your breath long enough to accomplish what needs to be done here." I gingerly touched the slits in my neck. "A little warning would have been nice," I grumbled. The inspector responded by kicking his legs and swimming further into the lake. "Follow me," he said distantly. "If I'm right, this thing is buried deep. We're going to have to dive all the way to the center." I swiveled in place and swam after him. I fully expected my sodden clothes to slow me down, but whatever the inspector had done to my body had apparently made them waterproof. It had also made me a better swimmer. I slipped through the lake like a human torpedo, my fingers brushing through strands of underwater plant life and disrupting tiny schools of fish. The inspector clung to the floor of the lake, so I did too. We sent clouds of sand whipping around us as we passed. After a minute or two of swimming, the ground sloped down sharply, and I noticed a dark shape hovering in the gloom just in front of us. "Alligator," my brain panicked. Before I told it, that was stupid. The shape grew clearer as we approached. It had 4 limbs, a small head, and it wasn't moving an inch. And it was wearing a soggy black suit. Panic swept through me again, and this time it didn't subside. I swung my arms around and came to a clumsy halt. "Jesus!" I cried. Bubbles shot in a stream from my mouth. The inspector turned to look back at me. "Mark," he said, "what do you see?" His eyes were still a piercing purple, even in the murky water. "My father-in-law," I stammered. His body, it's just floating there." Peter's corpse was pale and bloated, his open eyes staring off into the clouded lake. I watched as the currents from the inspector's passage spun him slowly in a circle, his wispy hair floating out in all directions. The urge to puke came over me, but I swallowed it down. "There's nothing there," the inspector said, staring past Peter's body. "The lake is making you hallucinate, Mark. It's just the contaminant doing its work." "Yeah," I said. "Yeah, of course." But the body sure as hell looked real, and I was afraid that if I reached out and touched it, my hand would brush against the threads of his decaying clothes. I shimmied past him, keeping my eyes averted, following the inspector deeper into the lake. The water was getting colder down here, although it would have been 10 times worse if my clothes had been sopping wet. It became clear that Peter's body wasn't the only one floating in Lake Lucid. The inspector and I passed a second corpse, then a third, then a pair of them who had drifted onto one another and gotten tangled. Their faces were pallid, but I recognized them. They were the suicides from the inspector's pictures. I knew they weren't real, I knew I shouldn't look, but I couldn't help myself. Their bodies were so small in death. Even Mike Schneider, the big burly auto mechanic, had a drained feeling about him. I kicked my legs and did my best to maneuver past the drowned. Then I recognized other faces. A mangled Edgar Guerrera, the first victim from the Time Eater case. A headless Harvey Jackson. A bullet-riddled Lester Barlow. The pattern was clear. My stomach lurched as I wove my way through a sea of all the people I hadn't saved. They drifted by me, unseeing, waterlogged and empty. A small corpse floated my way, much smaller than the rest. Black strands of hair blotted out his face. The currents moved his body, the hairs shifted, and I found myself staring into the dead face of my son. Rory floated there with all the rest, his mouth open in dull surprise. Behind him, Ruth revolved slowly, and Stephen drifted with his arms spread out like a bird. I started to shake. It wasn't because of the chill in the water. "It's my family," I said dimly. "They're here, Inspector. They're just like all the rest." "You're stronger than that, Mark," the inspector said from up ahead. This time he didn't turn around. "Don't let a shadow scare you. The real danger is up ahead." I tried to look away, but Ruth's vacant eyes turned in my direction then, frozen in an expression of hurt surprise. I wanted to reach out and grab her hand. Would I lose myself if I did? Would I end up just like my drowned neighbors, consumed by obsessive memories of my loved ones? "There," the inspector shouted. "I see it." I withdrew my hand, startled. I hadn't realized I'd been stretching out towards Ruth, my fingers curled. This time I managed to tear my eyes away. I twisted my body and kicked away from the illusion of my family, leaving them behind in a cloud of swirling sand. The inspector had stopped a few yards ahead and was now floating in place. I swam over to him. Down on the floor of the lake, in the tangle of the floating weeds, a bright salmon-pink shape was pulsing in the sand. It had the curved carapace of a crab, but this sucker was huge, maybe the size of a small horse. 6 broad claws extended from its body and drifted lazily through the water. It seemed to be glowing slightly. I peered a little closer and saw that the glow was actually a cloud of neon pink smoke, issuing from holes in the creature's shell. "That's one ugly motherfucker," I said quietly. "Is it giving off a pheromone or something?" "Or something," the inspector said. "The dream crab secretes a gas that causes visions and intense mood swings. It likes to squat at the bottom of ponds and lakes until it's tainted the water supply, and then it burrows into the ground and finds a new home." He frowned. "It's a stupid creature. I can't fathom how it managed to pass through the rift unless—" "Uh-oh," I interrupted. "I think it spotted us." The sand around the crab had started to roll, shooting great dusty clouds out into the water. A ring of beady eyes popped open along the circumference of the shell. I drifted back as a low, chittering noise rippled through the lake and sent goosebumps popping up and down my arms. "Get behind me," the inspector warned. "It's about to." One of the pink claws suddenly rocketed forward on a string of sticky sinew, like a ball on a rubber band. The inspector and I leapt aside. I found myself spinning, going head over heels, as the ensuing ripple buffeted my body aside. There was a loud snap as the claw closed on the spot where I had just been. I heard the next attack before I saw it. The chittering grew louder, a thrum went through the water, and then the second claw was shooting straight at me. I got my bearings just in time to kick my legs and avoid the ensuing snap. The air around me thickened with that pink smog, blurring my vision and hiding the giant crab from my sight. I floundered for a bit as the claw retreated for round 3. This was bad. The water muffled the sound of the creature's movements, and the smog kept me from seeing anything more than 10 feet from my face. The gun on my waist wouldn't do shit underwater, and I wasn't sure how helpful it would be even if I could use it. That carapace looked thick. Bullets might not even leave a dent on that thing. The water stirred again, sand rising up in a spiral, and I knew the next attack was imminent. I spun around and tried to get my bearings, but there was no sign of the crab anywhere. Nothing but noxious pink smoke and that awful chittering. I braced myself and tensed my muscles and waited for the creature to strike. But when the smog parted, it wasn't the giant crab I saw. It was the inspector. His coat was splayed out behind him and his lips were locked tight around his cigar. Rearing back, he puffed his cheeks and blew. A storm of purple smoke burst from the tip of the cigar and crashed into the pink cloud. The smog dispersed, turning into little curled wisps and vanishing. Then the purple tornado swept downward and burrowed into the creature who'd been hiding there. The chittering turned to a screech as the smoke coiled up and slipped inside the holes in the shell. I had no idea what was happening underneath, but I'm sure it wasn't pretty. The ring of eyes began to pop, one by one, leaving bloody streaks on the water. The claw flailed for a bit after that, but the fight was gone. Eventually, it slumped on the floor of the lake, gave a final rattle, and went quiet. The purple smoke emerged from the holes and billowed back to the inspector's cigar. I watched as he sucked it all back in one long, heavy breath. The last of the smoke vanished into its tip, which glowed a brief violet, and then the waters were clear again. I stared down at the crab's unmoving shell. "Fucking Christ," I said. "Remind me never to piss you off. Is it dead?" "I melted its internal organs," the inspector said simply, as if that was a perfectly ordinary thing to do. He swooped down to the creature's limp body. I tensed up, fully expecting the thing to snap back to life and cleave the inspector in two, but it really did seem to be dead. The inspector pushed aside its corpse with minimal effort and peered down into the sand. He brushed his fingers along the lake bed, a slight frown on his face. He said, so quiet I barely heard him. "Take a look at this, Mark." I swam over and squinted at the ground beneath him. The inspector had brushed the sand off a circular metal plate, a real high-tech gizmo with circuitry patterns across the front and a single bulb in the center flashing a low, pale green. Etched above the bulb was a simple red logo. Capra. "I've seen that before," I muttered. "Where have I seen that?" "In the forest," the inspector replied. "I found a capsule with this logo near the entrance to the Wendigo's universe. It's strange, isn't it? 2 Capra devices, 2 ancient creatures that haven't been seen this side of the rift in millennia." He went quiet, staring down at the metal disc. But what is Capra? I asked. What the hell is this stuff doing at the bottom of Lake Lucid? I don't know, the inspector said. But I think I know where we can start looking for answers. He lifted the device out of the sand. As he did so, a thick metal wire appeared, trailing down from the lip of the plate and into the lake bed. The inspector gave it a yank, and several feet of taut wire popped up out of the ground. We looked at each other and then off into the deeper reaches of the lake. Follow the wire, I said. Why do I get the feeling this is a seriously bad idea? It may be, the inspector admitted, but right now it's the best opportunity we have. His cigar tip glowed brightly for a second. The light flickered oddly in his eyes. Strange things have been happening in this town, he said. Strange, even for me. But I think the answer to everything lies at the end of this trail. Lead the way, then, I said. The inspector obliged by yanking more wire out of the sand and pulling himself along it, hand over hand. I skirted the giant crab corpse and floated after him. The fish were scarce down here, probably driven off by the dream crab or maybe even eaten. So aside from a few straggly weeds, we were alone. There was no sound except the soft rippling of water in our ears. We could have been in another world entirely. I hope you've all enjoyed the first part of the 7th entry in the Neverglades Mysteries, Lucid Dreams. I'll see you all in a couple days with the conclusion. As always, I'll include links to the original post, the artwork I've used, and the music I've used in the description down below. Goodbye.